Hi everyone, welcome back to the Anna-losophy Podcast. In the previous episode, we explored the myth of Narcissus from beginning to end. We followed the story through Ovid's metamorphosis, looked at the prophecy given by Narcissus, discussed Echo's role in the myth, and ended with the moment Narcissus recognized the face staring back at him in the water. If you haven't listened to that episode yet, I definitely recommend doing so if you're going to continue with this one, or maybe spending a few minutes familiarizing yourself with the original myth. Here are 3 links that helped me understand different aspects of the myth as well, so please feel free to check it out. Today's discussion builds directly upon that story, and many of the philosophical ideas we're going to explore make a lot more sense once the narrative is fresh in your mind. And today, I'd like to step away from the myth itself and focus on the ideas and the philosophy within it. Was Narcissus really guilty of vanity, or has that become a modern interpretation of a much more complicated ancient myth? The second question is returning to the question in today's title: are we all narcissists? By the end of the episode, I don't simply think we'll have a better understanding of narcissists. I think arguably we'll have a better understanding of ourselves. Because the reason this myth has survived for so long is not that it tells us about one young man in ancient Greece. It survives because it's quite relatable in one way or another. Because every generation eventually finds itself standing beside that same pool, wondering what it really means to know the person looking back at us. I hope you enjoy the episode. Let's begin with the first question. Was Narcissus actually guilty of vanity? At first, the answer seems intuitive. Yes. Almost everyone knows the myth in the same way. We picture a handsome young man who becomes so obsessed with his own beauty that he falls in love with himself. His name has become so closely associated with that idea that we rarely separate the myth from the psychological term. Today, if we call someone a narcissist, it immediately suggests arrogance, excessive self-love, and an obsession with appearance. Because that definition is so familiar, it's easy to assume that this must have been the message Ovid intended when he wrote the story nearly 2,000 years ago. But after reading Metamorphosis, I found myself questioning that assumption. I don't think Ovid was writing a warning against vanity. I think he was asking another philosophical question about identity itself. Let me explain. The first clue appears surprisingly early in the story. Ovid here spends very little time showing Narcissus admiring himself, because for most of the myth, Narcissus never actually sees himself. Instead, Ovid introduces us to a young man whose extraordinary beauty attracts almost everyone around him. Men and women alike fall in love with him. Echo becomes arguably the most famous example because her story survives alongside his. Regardless of who it is, though, Narcissus consistently rejects every person who approaches him. He appears emotionally distant, proud, and almost incapable of recognizing the feelings of others. There is certainly vanity in his character, and I don't think Ovid's trying to hide that. However, vanity alone can't explain why the story has remained one of the most famous and discussed myths in Western history. If the myth just ended there, it would become another ancient lesson about excessive pride, and Greek and Roman literature already contained countless stories that explored that same theme. In fact, audiences living in the ancient world were already very familiar with the dangers of pride. The Greeks even had a specific word for it: hubris. Hubris referred to excessive pride that challenged the natural order or offended the gods, and it appears throughout Greek tragedy. Characters such as Oedipus, Ajax, and Agamemnon all suffer because their confidence eventually blinds them to reality. By the time Ovid was writing at the beginning of the 1st century AD, stories about pride had existed for hundreds of years. That makes Narcissus pretty interesting because Ovid chooses a different path. Rather than allowing pride alone to destroy his character, he introduces one of the most famous moments in literature: the reflection in the pool. The entire direction of the myth changes from that point onwards, and that's the second clue. When Narcissus first kneels beside the water, he doesn't recognize the face looking back at him. And I think that detail alone is so important to understand the entire myth. We already know the ending though, so it's easy to overlook how interesting that moment really is. Narcissus believes that another person is hidden beneath the surface of the water. He doesn't know it's him. He smiles because the stranger smiles. He reaches forward because the stranger reaches towards him. Every movement convinces him that another person is present. Only later does he begin to realize that every expression and every emotion belongs to himself. In other words, Narcissus doesn't begin by loving himself. He begins by loving someone he believes is completely separate from himself. And that misunderstanding is what turns the myth from a story about vanity into a story about realizing everything, recognition. The historical context makes this moment even more interesting, and that's clue 3. Today, we're surrounded by our own reflections. For example, we encounter photographs, video recordings, security cameras, and mirrors. Seeing our own faces has become such an ordinary day-to-day experience that we don't really stop to think about it. The ancient world was different though. Although polished metal could produce a reflection, clear mirrors were expensive and they were not common. Most people would never have seen themselves with the clarity that modern mirrors provide. A still pool of water, therefore, becomes much more than a convenience setting for the story, but it's actually like a mirror. For Narcissus, it offers one of the clearest encounters with his own appearance that he has ever experienced. Ovid's original audience would have understood that encounter very differently from the way we do now. The reflection would have carried like a genuine sense of discovery rather than being familiar with oneself. As I kept reading, I realized that Ovid seems far more interested in recognition compared to admiration, and those two ideas might be pretty similar, but philosophically they're different. Admiration assumes that we already know what we're looking at, but recognition begins with something that we might not know of for sure, or it begins with uncertainty, in other words. It involves discovering something that has certainly always existed, but we were never really exposed to it. They were kind of hidden from us. Narcissus doesn't spend the story celebrating his own beauty. Not only does he not know that it's him, he thought he was loving someone else, not himself. He spends it trying to understand why the person beneath the water is so familiar and does everything that he does, because he doesn't know it's its reflection. And this matters because it changes the focus of the myth away from the appearance and towards its own identity. And this is exactly where philosophy enters the story. More than 500 years before Ovid wrote Metamorphoses, one short sentence had already become one of the most famous ideas ever in ancient Greece. That is, know thyself. The words were inscribed at the Temple of Apollo at Delphi, and they later became closely associated with Socrates, who believed that genuine wisdom begins with self-knowledge. According to Plato's dialogues, Socrates spent a lot of his life questioning people who believed they understood themselves and the world around them for sure. Again and again, he showed that certainty didn't really mean that you knew everything, but sometimes that meant you were ignorant of some situations. People confidently defined a lot of things, like happiness, justice, or courage, things that we now understand there's really no very clear definition for sure, until questioning or the Socratic method showed that they never truly examined those ideas at all. For Socrates, the greatest danger wasn't ignorance itself, but believing that we already possessed knowledge when we in fact didn't. When I thought about Socrates while reading Narcissus then, I found the myth even more fascinating. Tiresias predicts that Narcissus will enjoy a long life only if he never comes to know himself. For an audience familiar with the importance of self-knowledge, that prophecy would have sounded very confusing. I mean, what I thought at first was, how could knowing yourself become a curse? Isn't that important? And was Ovid deliberately challenging one of philosophy's oldest ideals? Now that I think about it, I don't really think so. Perhaps recognizing ourselves is a lot more difficult than people sometimes suggest. Looking at a reflection may tell us what we look like, but it doesn't tell us much about the person we are, like our personalities and our characteristics. A face can be recognized in an instant, but what about all the other things, like understanding ourselves, our identity, and our character? Those things take such a long time to explore, sometimes an entire lifetime. But philosophers continued dealing with that same problem long after the ancient world disappeared. In the 17th century, René Descartes famously declared, "Cogito ergo sum," I think, therefore I am, believing that conscious thought provided the first certainty from which philosophy could begin. We're gonna talk about Descartes later, but this is all you need to know for context. A few decades later, John Locke argued that personal identity depended on memory. David Hume disagreed, suggesting that whenever he examined himself, he found no permanent identity waiting to be discovered. Instead, he found an ever-changing stream of thoughts, emotions, and experiences. Reading those philosophers reminded me that the question raised by Narcissus has never really been answered. What exactly is the self, and what does it mean? Is it our body, our memories, our personality, our relationships with other people? Or is identity just something that constantly changes throughout our lives? I think Ovid understood that these questions were far more interesting than simply asking whether pride or vanity itself is a bad thing or dangerous, and that is why the reflection is a very powerful symbolic representation. Water, for example, can reproduce literally every physical detail with a lot of accuracy, but it can't reveal a person's character, values, or inner life, or the things they experienced beforehand. It reflects appearance perfectly, but it doesn't tell us much about identity. But Narcissus mistakes one for the other. He believes that seeing himself is the exact same thing as knowing himself, but those aren't the same experience at all. In many ways, the myth suggests that recognizing a face is one of the easiest things we can do, but recognizing the person behind that face is one of the hardest tasks we can ever undertake. So, was Narcissus guilty of vanity? I think the answer is yes, but I also think that answer is incomplete. He's not completely prideful. Of course, his pride kind of explains the beginning of the myth, but it can't explain why readers have continued discussing the story. The moment Narcissus recognizes himself, the myth moves beyond morality and into the realm of philosophy. It becomes a story about identity and the possibility that the person we spend our entire lives living with may also be the person we understand the least. That, more than vanity, is why I think Narcissus continues to speak to us today. Now I'd like to return to the second question that gave this episode its title. Are we all narcissists? So before I started researching for this episode, I probably would have answered that question very differently. I would have associated narcissism with excessive pride, vanity, and self-importance, because that is how the word is almost always used today. But after spending some time with Ovid's original text, however, I found myself thinking less about narcissism and much more about identity. The more I reflected on the myth, the more I realized that perhaps the reason it has survived for so long is because every human being eventually asks the same question that's in this story. Who am I? And that question is much older than psychology, much older than the word narcissism, and perhaps even older than philosophy itself. It's arguably one of the foundations of philosophy. When ancient Greek philosophers began asking questions about human nature during the 6th and 5th centuries BC, they weren't simply trying to understand the world around them. On top of that, they were trying to understand themselves. Of course, one of the most famous inscriptions in the ancient world is Know Thyself. And it's only 2 words, it's 1 sentence. But philosophers quickly realized that it might be one of the hardest instructions anyone could ever follow. Because how do we actually know ourselves? Is it enough to recognize our own face? And is it enough to understand our own thoughts? Can anyone ever completely understand the person they're becoming? And those questions never really disappeared. They continued through many, many people, especially philosophers like Socrates, Plato, and Aristotle reappeared in the writings of St. Augustine during the 4th and 5th centuries, resurfaced with René Descartes in the 17th century, and still occupy people today. Every generation seems to rediscover the same thing. We spend our entire lives living with ourselves, but we never stop learning who we are. And that is why I think the title of this episode and the answer beneath it shouldn't be a yes or no, because I don't think that's the nature of the question. Human beings naturally think about themselves, because we're the only creatures capable of reflecting upon our own existence. That is, we remember the past, we imagine the future, and we look at or revise the story we tell ourselves about who we are. Personally, none of those things strike me as signs of narcissism. They strike me as evidence of consciousness itself, because the ability to ask who am I is one of the defining and fundamental characteristics of being human. Remove that question and philosophy arguably would lose one of its oldest and most important foundations. But I also think identity develops very differently from the way many of us imagine it. It's tempting to believe that somewhere inside each of us there exists just one permanent self waiting to be discovered, and we'll do it later, almost like a sculpture hidden beneath a block of marble. But history suggests something much more interesting. In 1690, John Locke argued that memory provides continuity throughout our lives. More than 40 years later, David Hume disagreed, writing in 1739 that whenever he examined himself, he never encountered one permanent identity at a time at all. Instead, he found loads of thoughts, emotions, and experiences flowing continuously into one another. Reading Hume made me pause a little bit because it challenged an assumption I had never questioned either. Perhaps identity is something that gradually takes shape the more we live life. For example, when I look back at my own life, I realize that the person I was as a child no longer exists in quite the same way. My interests have changed, my opinions have changed, the books I enjoy reading definitely have changed, even the questions I ask have changed. But despite all those differences, I still think of myself as the same person. But it's a very fascinating puzzle because what exactly remains constant while everything else changes gradually? Is identity found in memory and personality and the choices we make? Or is it something that really can't be captured by any single definition? It's really confusing. And philosophers have debated those questions for centuries because there's never been a definitive answer that satisfies everyone. Thinking about Narcissus through that perspective completely changed the way I understood the myth. Standing beside the pool, he believes that understanding himself will come through observation. He remains there because he becomes convinced that the reflection contains some sort of answer. The longer he looks, the more certain he becomes that the explanation he wants is just beyond his reach. But the reflection can only show what he can see. It reproduces every physical detail, but it can't reveal other things like memory, courage, wisdom, or compassion. Those qualities emerge through the way a person lives instead of the way a person looks. In other words, appearance isn't necessarily everything to be able to understand yourself. Ovid's pool, therefore, is a symbolic representation of the limits of appearance. It reminds us that a reflection can introduce us to a face, but it can't introduce us to a life, which is actually a further on addition for the first question. I think that idea becomes relevant when we step away from the ancient mythology and consider our own lives. Every one of us has moments when we wonder when we're becoming the person we hope to become. And those moments often arrive a lot. They might follow a difficult decision, the end of an important relationship with a friend, or the beginning of a completely new chapter of your life. And without even noticing it, we begin comparing who we are with who we thought we would become, and philosophy has never treated those moments as signs of vanity. On the contrary, they have often been regarded as moments of genuine growth because they require honesty and integrity. During the 19th century, Friedrich Nietzsche wrote that becoming who we are is one of life's greatest challenges. I always found that choice of words very meaningful and compelling, because he didn't write about discovering who we are, as though identity were just hidden somewhere waiting to be found. He said it's not like that. He wrote about becoming. And that word alone suggests change and development and growth and a transition, like a movement. A person's character is impacted gradually by experience, disappointment, joy and perseverance, and our responsibility. So looking into a mirror alone can't accomplish that work, because identity is never built through observation, but it grows through participating in life. Seen from that perspective, the tragedy of Narcissus feels very different. He doesn't simply become trapped by his own beauty, but he becomes stuck by the belief that one image can provide complete understanding, or in other words, the answer. The longer he remains beside the water, the further he gets away from the experiences through which identity really develops. Ovid seems to suggest that genuine self-knowledge can't exist in isolation. It's slow, like gradual, through the choices we make, the people we encounter, the life we are willing to live, even if it takes forever. The reflection offers certainty about appearance, but if we're certain about our appearance, it's never been the same thing as understanding a person. So, are we all narcissists? I don't think that's the conclusion I reached after reading the myth. I think every one of us is engaged in the lifelong search for identity in some way or another, and that search is one of philosophy's oldest subjects. Narcissus reminds us that understanding ourselves is a worthwhile pursuit, but he also reminds us that there are limits to what reflection can teach us. A mirror can reproduce a face for a few moments. A human identity, though, is impacted over decades and billions of decisions. And perhaps that is why Ovid's story continues to speak to readers for such a long time, more than 2,000 years after it was actually written. The myth was never simply asking us to think about vanity, but it was inviting us to consider one of the most difficult questions we'll ever ask. It's not what we look like or what we do, but who are we genuinely becoming? Who are we?